Bediuzzaman is a name that he gets later on in his life. He's born Said Nursi, and Bediuzzaman means wonder of the age, or his own age perhaps. And this is something that we'll discuss as we go on. Just very quickly, why it's significant to study the life of our scholars. Of course, firstly, for contextual depth and better understanding of the text itself, rather than just letters on a page. It's something that's written in a context for a purpose. And if we're looking at this through an Islamic lens, of course, in the word of Allah, that of all of his servants, only the knowledgeable of his might are truly in awe of him. Allah is indeed the Almighty or forgiving. So this verse from the Quran kind of confirms that those knowledgeable, those scholars, are the ones that can kind of truly get closer to knowing Allah than perhaps lay people like myself. And that's why the life and works of such scholars are important. There's of course a hadith, the prophets did not inherit money, but rather knowledge. So whoever follows the same path is lucky, as well as, a reason for why we should study and then try to perhaps imitate or adapt our lives to those of scholars as well. They're lived examples of our times who start being, who passed away in the 1960s, or 1960 precisely. It's kind of relatable human experience, and it's also a translation of the life of prophets as well, because Ustad uses the example of the prophet in his own life as well. So, very quickly, Nursi is born into a religious family in the village of Nurs. His mother, he says, is his first teacher. He gave significant knowledge. He was, raised in a family where knowledge, both spiritual and kind of religious knowledge, and knowledge of how perhaps to be the best of one in character, was upheld very highly. He was cautious of what is halal and haram, and he's the middle child, which is somewhat important because we'll look at some of his relatives, like his elder sister, who was carried forth and born under the name Hanum, which in kind of English is just translated as lady, perhaps, or miss. She was later called an alima or alima, perhaps to say it in Arabic, who was married to a scholar, but she would also give religious lectures herself in Greater Syria. And if her husband was to make a mistake whilst teaching, many of his students would say, perhaps you should go and consult your wife and then reteach this area to us tomorrow. So he has this kind of scholarship, is something that's in his very immediate family as well, and something that he is brought up with from a very early age. He says that he learned compassion from his mother and wisdom and order from his father. He has this kind of very intense madrasa life, several places here. What's interesting about Said Nursi is he never stays too long in one place. And perhaps those places where he's forced to stay are in his periods of exile, or when he's being held hostage, is that he's bound to somewhere. But otherwise, the madrasas that he tends to kind of debate a lot of things that come up with his teachers and scholars, and decides to move on and experience a lot of different Islamic intellectual kind of endeavors himself. In 1907, he travels towards Istanbul to actualize some sort of ideal that he has. This is where, although prior he's become a bit famous in the east of Turkey, he kind of makes a name for himself at the Shakir Jahan, where hundreds of scholars and students come. Some board and live there, other come to this kind of like hub for socialization, and he's invited individuals to ask their questions, and he answers all the questions that these scholars or students have. And this is where he begins to grow in popularity. But he's also beginning to kind of be seen as like a dangerous individual by the state, and he's placed briefly in a mental asylum for this period. Like I said, he was unique. He couldn't stay in a single madrasa for too long. He wouldn't shy away from asking questions. He grows in popularity because of a series of debates that he has, and that he answers or tries to answer questions. And from that, 1897, he's invited by the governor of Van to visit him in his kind of place of residence. And they have discussions with other scholars there. And from the kind of eloquent answers that Ustad was able to give, he was given the title Bediuzzaman during this period. So he quickly, begins to read alongside this very kind of solid Islamic knowledge that he's got early on into kind of the more positivist sciences. He writes a recitala on math. He plans out the school, Bediuzzaman, in which Islamic and positivistic sciences would be taught in sync, and harmony, which is something that for him is very important. One of the most important quotes of his that I think is, "The light of the conscience is faith, and the light of the mind is knowledge. Truth can only be manifested by the coherence and unity of both." And by here, truth, he means, firm belief or faith in Allah can only be manifested if we have faith and knowledge side together. Some of the early periods of his life, we're into the 20th century now. He would be politically active. He aided in repressing some of the riots. You have kind of towards the fall of the Ottoman Empire at this period. There's a lot of political turmoil in Turkey. He's trying to repress these, but from this he's tried for execution, but of course isn't executed. War breaks out, World War I. And conflicts are going on all corners of Turkey and the Middle East, the world perhaps in general. The Medresa Zehra that he's began to build, he leaves the building half complete and goes to join battle. This period of his life, I think, is very important because it shows that he's involved in social matters around him. And this is something which informs how he looks at Islam. The fact that he doesn't give up, I think, is quite important. He has one of his kind of famous commentaries on Al-Fatiha, and the first 33 verses of Al-Baqarah is written on horseback at the front. He's later held hostage, and this is kind of how long, hours and minutes it would take to get back to where he was, and he's held hostage by Russians at this point, with some of his students. After this period of hostage, he comes back to Turkey, but he's not particularly welcomed in Istanbul at this time. In 1918, there is, of course, a beginning of the British occupation of Istanbul at the same time, but he's been seen as an inconvenience himself. So what does this period until now show us about Ustad? That he's a knowledgeable individual, both in religious and scientific knowledge. He's a leader. He has the ability to influence and shape minds. He is resilient. If you looked at the kind of several hostage situations, exile situations that he faced. He's a custodian of faith. So he's firm in his belief. Even on horseback, he finished writing Quranic commentary. And he's also sensitive to social issues, which I think is something that's important. But this period is kind of short-lived in the sense that Ustad now enters this new Said phase. He has an old and new Said, with 1921 kind of being the balance of that. He shifts away from being this person involved in politics and believing that the Islamic world can be perhaps saved by these structures, to something more solitary. Perhaps we could say, more involved in some Sufi traits, going away from politics, away from fame, and trying to believe or be firm in the belief that jihad is now with knowledge. Goes to Ankara, has to leave Ankara. He begins teaching in Van, this kind of derelict area you see here. But despite not being active in politics anymore, he is sent away on several, as we could say, exiles. So you've got this journey from Van all the way to Barla, and I'll show you a map at the well. If you know Turkey well, this isn't an easy journey by any chance. So this is the kind of journey that he's on, and he's been sent by the state at this point. This is where he lives in Barla, so he's kind of where the most significant pieces of his New Said, so 1921 onwards, area is kind of the fruit of the work he does here. So he's living opposite this police station. He's got the eyes are on him all the time. Ankara is the capital of Turkey, is demanding frequent reports on his activity. He's not allowed to see everyone. There are a lot of propaganda against him in the area that he's living. He's poisoned and he has his kind of human rights restricted. But despite this, the Risala was written, or the main parts of it was written during this period. I've got, some were solely the source of perhaps divine inspiration, as he says, like words like Asay Musa. There are other bits that are written a bit everywhere, really, like says that whenever Ustad has the opportunity, he has periods of being in prison, and some of his work is written in those areas too. This is just some photos, and I'm going to go quickly because I'm aware of my time. One of, again, his most favorite, my favorite quotes of him is, it's not the time to save the sects or the tariqah perhaps, it's the time to save our Iman. There are many who have entered heaven without being membership of a sect or a tariqah perhaps, but no one enters heaven without Iman. So Ustad really focuses on how on earth we could protect Iman at this stage. Here are just some of his students that he had, and different periods of his life, various images from the different exiles. Another important point in his life is 1946. He allows the Risale, which at that point is written by him dictating and his students writing, especially in the period in Barla, is now being given to the printing press, something that was a bit contentious at the time. And in 1947, it was sent to Europe and the US. Several more sentences coming in his life and arrests. Some of his other images. Just some kind of very, very late parts of his life now. He meets with the Greek patriarch in Istanbul to discuss closer cooperation with Christians. So the later part of his life is really given to increase dialogue as a way of means of protecting Iman itself. He makes this Sparta his home, but he still continues, touring Turkey. And in 1956, through several court processes, his works were allowed to be published. He passes away in 1960. This is just kind of some of the last steps that he had in his life. The most kind of important, perhaps the last ones here, is that he passes away in Urfa on the 23rd of March. He's buried in the Halilur Rahman Mosque in Urfa on the 24th of March. But his body was later moved and buried in a kind of undisclosed location because the state was worried that they would perhaps become some sort of a shrine and then start some sort of a movement. Ustad's property, and I couldn't really find it in English. I could have translated, but I didn't, so I kind of forgive me. He has things like, a pair of broken glasses or spectacles, I think you call them in American English. I don't know, we call them glasses, so what I've got on my eyes. One towel, an old shirt, 2 cups as things that are part of his items that he's collected during this period. So he lives in a series or a life of exile, hostage, and productivity in this sense. So just quickly on to the text that we're reading today. The Flashes, or otherwise known as the Gleams, depending on which translation you're reading. It's the 3rd volume in the Risale Nur collection. There are 33 parts or flashes, which look at several areas. The main purpose of the flashes is, as with the whole Risale Nur, really solving the purpose of existence of man in this world. But if you compare, for example, the Gleams to something like the words, you will notice that there are a lot more, I think, concrete examples. I mean, the words can become a bit more philosophical. The flashes is more concrete. So we have topics that are explored very early on, for example, are the relevance of prophetic supplications to today's day and age. So what the lives of Prophet Yunus were or Ayub were, their supplications, and what that means for us in today's day and society. the meaning of the hadith, die before you die, sincerity, nature, messages for the sick, and the 6 divine names of Allah are kind of areas that are explored, and some of these are things that we will discuss in today's retreat.